Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Getting ready to step into your career era? Set yourself apart with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Hone your skills with apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and more, powered with the latest in creative AI. Students save over 55%, so you can build a portfolio you're proud of. Launch your future with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Visit adobe.com/students to learn more.
Excuse me, Laurie.
Oh, Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
What's up, everyone? I'm your host, Will, and you're listening to One Good Scare, the show where we explore our favorite horror movies. I don't know about you, but I'm absolutely ready to dive into one of my all-time favorite horror movies, Candyman, with the late, great Tony Todd. A couple of quick housekeeping things. As always, you can follow One Good Scare on Instagram at OneScarePod and on TikTok at One Good Scare Pod. Make sure to follow and leave a comment or two. I love interacting and discussing. It's one of my favorite parts of this whole thing. Also, be sure to leave a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Pods. It lets me know you're enjoying the show, and that goes a long way to keeping it going. And remember, my goal with One Good Scare is not to replace your viewing experience. It's to enhance it. So if you haven't seen Candyman, or if it's been a while, my strong encouragement is to watch it first, then come back and give the show a listen. Of course, if you'd rather listen than watch, I appreciate that as well. Just remember, one good scare is one gigantic spoiler. Alright, it's time to settle in as we explore what I think is a terrific horror movie, Candyman. It's no secret that Candyman is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, though I think to some degree reception has been mixed. The numbers support this. IMDb has it at a 6.7 out of 10. Rotten Tomatoes lists it as a 79% fresh rating, though only a 63% popcorn meter. Shudder has it as a 4.9 out of 5, and Metacritic lists it as a 61%. Now, there are some legitimate criticisms and concerns about the movie, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But overall, it seems to have garnered positive reviews in response. For me at least, something that isn't in question are the acting performances of Virginia Madsen and Tony Todd. Both are mesmerizing in their respective roles, and their chemistry is off the charts. Flaws aside, their performances make this movie a must-watch. Okay. It's time to settle down and turn down the lights as we dive deep into Candyman. The movie opens with a bird's eye shot of city streets and highway, the word Candyman scrolling from top to bottom, followed by the principal cast, as haunting music, composed by Philip Glass, plays sharply. Alright, a real quick cut-in. The music for Candyman is terrific and crawls deeply into your brain. A few years before Candyman was released, Philip Glass was asked by director Bernard Rose to compose a score for the movie. Philip Glass agreed, and according to his website, quote, wrote a gothic score for chorus and pipe organ, end quote. Except he composed the score with one vision in mind, and was less than thrilled with how the movie turned out. Despite this, Glass's score remains one of the most unique and iconic ever composed for a horror movie, and it's as readily identifiable as the scores for Halloween, The Exorcist, Psycho, Jaws, The Thing, and more. A cutscene shows a swarm of bees with Candyman's voice overlaid. We then see the bees engulfing the Chicago skyline, with the former Sears Tower front and center, as a woman screams in the background. Candyman's voice cuts back in, saying, "I came for you," as the scene transitions to the face of a woman smoking a cigarette. She's listening to a story about a babysitter, Clara, who was babysitting when one night she invited a guy named Billy over. When he arrived, the two of them ran upstairs to have sex. But first, Clara asks Billy if he's ever heard of Candyman. He says no, and she tells him that Candyman has a hook for a hand, and if you say his name 5 times in the mirror, he'll appear behind you breathing down your neck. She asks Billy if he wants to try. The two turn to face the bathroom mirror, and Billy starts, saying Candyman 4 times before stopping. He turns to kiss Clara, who tells him to go downstairs and wait for her. With Billy downstairs, Clara says Candyman's name a 5th time before turning off the bathroom light. She screams as he suddenly appears in the mirror, and when Billy looks up, blood pours down from the ceiling. The storyteller says Billy's hair turned white from the shock. Candyman killed Clara by splitting her open with his hook, before killing the baby. Billy went crazy soon afterwards. The woman listening to the story, whose name is Helen, walks the halls of a school campus laughing to herself before walking into a classroom where another woman, Bernadette, is sitting at a desk opposite a male student. Bernadette asks the guy where he first heard the story, and he says his friend heard it on the radio. He asks if the women are doing a paper on serial killers, and Helen says something like that while lighting a cigarette. As the guy walks out, Helen and Bernadette sit across from one another, and Helen hands Bernadette her cigarette. An overhead shot takes us to the University of Illinois, Chicago, where a professor is lecturing about urban legends. Helen walks into the lecture hall as he continues talking about oral folklore. The bell rings, and she notices a female student talking with the professor as the rest of the students file out. The two are married, and he introduces her to a small group of students that have gathered around. As one of the students, Stacy, heads out, she asks him about her. There's a tinge of concern in her question. The professor, whose name is Trevor, says there's nothing to worry about. Helen then tells him that he promised not to give that lecture until the following semester, and Trevor counters by saying he can't hold up the student's education. Helen is then shown sitting in an office, reviewing her notes about the dead babysitter, when a maintenance worker walks in. The maintenance worker mentions something about Candyman, which piques Helen's interest. The maintenance worker then says she has a friend who knows all about him. The maintenance worker, whose name is Henrietta Mosley, introduces her friend Kitty Culver to Helen, and the two sit down to talk. Helen asks about Candyman, and Kitty says he killed a woman, Ruthie Jean, who heard strange noises like someone was trying to make a hole in the wall of her bathroom. Ruthie called 911 and told officers there was someone coming through the walls. She called again, and when police got there, they found Ruthie Jean dead. Helen asks if she was shot, and Kitty tells her she was killed with a hook. Henrietta says Candyman killed her, and Kitty quickly gets up, saying, "I don't know nothing about that." Alright, real quick, there's something really interesting here. The movie Candyman is built on 2 stories, one fact and the other fiction. On April 22nd, 1987, Ruthie Mae McCoy, a 52-year-old woman, called police and told them someone was breaking into her apartment in the Chicago projects through the bathroom mirror. On April 24th, 2 days later, she was found dead in her apartment. She'd been shot 4 times. If you're interested in hearing the full story, listen to my other show, The Red Treehouse, episode 63, The Legend of Candyman. In 1985, though, Clive Barker published the short story, The Forbidden, as part of a 5-volume anthology series entitled Books of Blood. In that story, Barker gives the backstory to a character who later became Candyman. The short story is absolutely terrific, and I can't recommend it enough. The scene then shows a newspaper reel spinning as the iconic piano music plays. The headlines show an increase in murders in the area. A serial killer seems to be at large, and Helen reads the headline about Ruthie Jean. Helen shows her research to Bernadette. She pulls out a picture of Cabrini Green, and Bernadette says she wouldn't even drive past there, explaining a kid got shot there the other day. Helen responds, "Every day." She tells Bernadette to look carefully at the picture before sliding another one to the side. Bernadette isn't sure what she's looking at, and Helen says it's not Cabrini Green. It's her apartment building, which was originally built as a housing project. Bernadette doubts it, but Helen walks over to the window and pulls the curtains open. She explains how the city altered the building, portioned off condos, and sold it to the highest bidder. Helen takes Bernadette to her bathroom, where she pulls the mirror off the wall. There's no wall between the condos, and it's just a medicine cabinet set back to back. Helen pushes the medicine cabinet in, revealing the adjoining condo, which is abandoned. Bernadette jokes there is someone in there as Helen puts her medicine cabinet back in place. The two laugh and start saying Candyman, getting to 4 times before Helen leans in and whispers his name a 5th time. Bernadette chickens out and the two laugh. The scene then shifts to the middle of the night, where Helen is asleep in her bed. She hears a strange noise and calls out to Trevor, who jumps into bed and terrifies her. The next day, Helen and Bernadette are shown driving through the city. Bernadette puts pepper spray or mace into her purse, and the two go back and forth about what they're planning to do. Bernadette says the gangs hold the entire neighborhood hostage, and Helen suggests that they turn around and write a boring thesis about urban legends. She's obviously being facetious. She tells Bernadette that they have a real chance, that the community has started attributing the horrors of their everyday life to a mythical figure. Bernadette agrees, and the two pull up to Cabrini Green. A gang stands outside, keeping watch. Helen and Bernadette head towards the building as gang members sneer at them. They say they're going inside to see a friend of theirs, as gang members continue jeering, accusing them of being cops. The two take the stairs, and Helen snaps a few photos along the way. As they reach the 4th floor, she snaps a picture of graffiti that reads, "Sweets to the sweet." Suddenly, an apartment door opens up and a woman is holding a dog on a leash. Startled, Helen and Bernadette walk into an abandoned apartment. Helen says the layout is identical to hers. Bernadette cautions her that a woman died in the apartment, but Helen presses forward. They enter the bathroom, where they notice a hole behind the medicine cabinet. Helen wants to crawl through, but Bernadette cautions her that there may be gang members on the other side. Helen goes anyway and takes the camera from Bernadette. She eventually walks through a hole in the wall, which reveals a painting of a man's open mouth, as suspenseful music plays in the background. She stares into the eyes of the figure and seemingly becomes disoriented for a moment. She bends down and notices candy wrappers on the ground. Meanwhile, Bernadette sits quietly in the bathroom when suddenly Helen bursts through and says she ran out of film and has to go back. Bernadette puts her foot down and says no way, and as they close the bathroom mirror, the woman who was holding the dog from earlier asks what they're doing there. Helen explains that they're from the university, and she introduces themselves. The woman invites them into her apartment as she cares for her baby. She asks what the two are gonna say, that the people of the neighborhood are all the same, that they steal, gangbang, are all on drugs. She says she just wants to raise her child, whose name is Anthony. Then she introduces herself as Anne-Marie McCoy, and Helen apologizes for disturbing her. Anne-Marie says the white folks that come around the area aren't friendly, and she apologizes for being rude. Anne-Marie then expresses hope for her child and asks if the two want to know about Ruthie Jean. She says everyone wants to know, and tells Helen and Bernadette that she heard Ruthie Jean screaming. Anne-Marie dialed 911, but no one came because they were all scared. She says everyone is scared, that she is scared. She says they'll never catch him. Helen asks who, and Anne-Marie says Candyman. The next scene shows Helen sitting in a restaurant with Trevor, Bernadette, Professor Purcell, and Bernadette's significant other. Purcell tells them he's heard about their research and he offers to help. Helen says they're not ready yet. Purcell pushes it and says he can be of help, but Helen counters with, "We're about to bury you." Bernadette says they'll have something for him to read in a week, and that they just went to Cabrini Green that day. Purcell says they have to read a paper he wrote 10 years before, and tells them the origin story of Candyman. He says the Candyman legend first appeared in 1890, and that Candyman was the son of a slave. Candyman's father had made a fortune inventing a device for the mass production of shoes, and had sent him to the best schools. Candyman was a talented artist who was sought after by the wealthy to paint portraits. One time, he was commissioned by a wealthy landowner to paint his daughter. The two fell in love, and she became pregnant. Poor Candyman. The girl's father took revenge and paid others to chase Candyman through the town to what is now Cabrini Green. Once there, they sawed off his right hand with a rusty blade. Candyman cried out for help, but no one came. Nearby, there was an apiary, and the hired murderers smashed the hives and stole the honey. Then, they smeared it all over Candyman, and he was subsequently stung to death by thousands of bees. Then they burned his body on a pyre and scattered his ashes over Cabrini Green. And this is the end of Act 1. Okay, so to this point, Act 1 has focused on establishing the foundation for the Candyman legend. We're getting bits and pieces of the lore that make up the urban legend itself, and we're seeing how it affects those who believe in it. Helen's conversation with Henrietta and Kitty grounds the urban legend in real life. And honestly, it's tough to figure out where reality stops and the legend begins. And that's the point, because what we're going to find out is that Candyman derives his power from the faith of his followers. Doubt is anathema, but belief is life. Also, let's talk about Virginia Madsen. She's absolutely entrancing as Helen, and the role was made for her. I remember reading somewhere that she was the first choice for the role, but that if she turned it down or was unavailable, it would have gone to Sandra Bullock. Now, I think Sandra Bullock is a terrific actress, but I cannot picture her in this movie at all. We'll talk about Cabrini Green in a little bit, along with some of the controversy surrounding the movie. But for now, let's dive back into Act 2. Act 2 opens with Helen back at Cabrini Green. This time she's taking pictures in the abandoned apartment. As she walks down the hallway, she knocks on the door of Anne Marie, but a little kid, Jake, tells her she's not there. Helen makes small talk and asks if he knows anything about Ruthie Jean, but the kid says he doesn't know anything. She tries to convince him that it's safe to talk to her because she's not a cop. He says he won't say anything because Candyman will get him. He says she's crazy for walking around Cabrini Green. Helen counters by saying he could show her where Candyman is. Then she promises that it'll be their little secret, unless he's too scared. Jake gets up and walks her out of the apartment building, past a huge stack of furniture and trash. He points towards a public restroom and says, "In there." Jake tells her about an earlier murder that took place in the restroom, where they found a boy who was holding his genitals and lying in a pool of blood. Jake says blood was everywhere. He says they found the boy's penis floating in the toilet. And then, you can't fix that. Better off dead. Alright, so a couple of things here. First, I really don't love this scene, and here's why. Helen pretty much manipulates Jake, a child, to do what she wants him to do. It's crazy when you watch it closely. She tells him she can be trusted because she's not a cop. And listen, I know we're analyzing a movie, but tons of untrustworthy people don't wear a badge. Jake clearly tells her no, but Helen persists and mocks him by saying he's too scared to tell her. Then she says it'll be our little secret. Alright, what the fuck, Helen? Look, if you're an adult, don't ever tell a kid it'll be our secret. It's just fucking wrong and creepy and weird. On the other side, Jake is pretty terrific in these scenes. He's wholly unbothered by what they're talking about, and deadpans his way through it all. It's the exact perfect tone for this interaction. Alright, back to the movie. Helen tells Jake to stay outside before stepping inside the bathroom. She snaps a few pictures while holding back her nausea. She opens each stall one by one and notices the wall says, "Sweets to the sweet." As she opens the third stall, an arrow is pointing into the toilet, and when she opens the lid, it is filled with bees. Meanwhile, outside, a man walks up behind Jake, who says, "Candyman," after turning around. Helen then hears someone walk in. He's wearing a floor-length trench coat and is followed by a handful of other guys. As Helen excuses herself, he pulls out a hook from behind his back. Helen says she's not a cop and that she's from the university. As she tries to walk out, one of the guys grabs her from behind. She pleads with him to let her go, but the man holding the hook says, "I hear you're looking for Candyman, bitch. Well, you found him." He then hits her on the side of the head with the dull side of the hook before exiting the building. Jake walks into the bathroom and finds Helen lying unconscious in a pool of blood. The next scene takes us to the police station as several men, including the man with the hook, step forward and say, "I hear you're looking for Candyman, bitch." Helen correctly identifies the man who assaulted her, and we see that her eye is swollen shut and bruised. Detective Valento says they swept Cabrini Green and tells Helen she's lucky to be alive. She asks if he killed Ruthie Jean, and the detective says yes, and the kid as well. He tells Helen she will be a witness at trial. As she leaves the office, she sits next to Jake and thanks him for saving his life. Jake chastises Helen for lying and not keeping their secret. He says, "Candyman will get me." But Helen says he's just a story. Jake seems disbelieving of this. A few days later, Trevor comes in from work as Helen preps dinner. Her eye is healing and the two share a meal. Haunting piano music plays as the camera pans overhead atop the university. Bernadette embraces Helen, and she expresses her frustration that the cops locked down Cabrini Green after she was attacked, but did nothing when Ruthie Jean and the young boy were murdered. As the two walk, Bernadette surprises Helen with the developed pictures from just before she was attacked, and says there's been interest in their work since then. As Helen walks through the parking garage looking at the pictures, we see someone walking towards her. As she arrives at her car, a voice calls out to her by name. She turns and sees a man standing in the distance. He's looking up. His arms are behind his back. He says, "Helen, I came for you," as she has flashbacks to the abandoned apartment. She seems entranced as she asks, "Do I know you?" He says, "No, but you doubted me," and begins walking towards her. The flashbacks continue. He says, "You were not content with the stories, so I was obliged to come." Suddenly, he pulls his hands forward, revealing a hook jammed into a bloody stump. He says, "Be my victim. Be my victim. I am the writing on the wall, the whisper in the classroom. Without these things, I am nothing. So now, I must shed innocent blood. Come with me." So this is our first real appearance of Tony Todd as Candyman, and everything about this first appearance is powerful. His stance, cadence, tone of voice, all of it works to perfectly bring Candyman to life. Tony Todd's performance is layered. We know he's the bad guy. He tells Helen to become his victim. But he's also mesmerizing and haunting. You almost forget that he's a murderous villain. I read something interesting the other day. Virginia Madsen claimed she was hypnotized for some of these scenes, and that she asked for it to stop because she became uncomfortable with the whole thing. And if you watch the whole scene closely, her eyes do seem distant and somewhat empty as she converses with Candyman. Suddenly, the scene changes, and we see Helen asleep and hear someone screaming in the background. A pan-out shot shows Helen on the floor, covered in blood. She's in Anne Marie's apartment, and we see that her dog has been decapitated with a meat cleaver. As Helen moves through the apartment, she sees Anne-Marie screaming over Anthony's crib. Anne-Marie calls her a liar and rushes her, yelling that her baby is missing. She bangs Helen's head on the floor repeatedly, before Helen slashes her arm with the meat cleaver. As Helen tells Anne-Marie to stop, police burst through the door. Helen is then shown being led away in handcuffs. The next scene has Helen at the police station as she is strip searched by another officer. She is covered in blood, sobbing, and asking for Detective Valento. The officer ignores her and continues with the search. Afterwards, Detective Valento comes in and says Helen is under arrest, and though she tries to explain the situation, he is not hearing it. He reads her Miranda rights and explains the situation and says Anne-Marie returned home to find Helen in the apartment and her dog's head cut off. Helen then attacked Anne-Marie with the meat cleaver. Helen asks for her phone call and tries to reach Trevor, but he's not home and the call goes unanswered. She leaves a message saying she's been arrested and needs to be picked up. The officer tells her it's 3 a.m. As Helen sits in her cell, she has flashbacks to the abandoned apartment. Anthony is there along with Candyman. Trevor suddenly rushes in, and as they leave the precinct, a crowd has swarmed outside. Her lawyer says they have no comment as they push through. The three of them debrief back at Trevor and Helen's apartment, and she is told the police will charge her with first-degree murder. Her attorney asks if there are any details she can recall to help confirm her version of events, but Helen says she blacked out, and when she woke up, she was covered in blood. Helen is then seen taking a bath, and Trevor says he needs to run to the office for a few minutes. Helen asks where he was when she called from the police station the night before. He says he was at home, asleep, and that he thought that she was at Bernadette's. He tries to reassure her before heading out. Afterwards, Helen sips a beer and lights a cigarette before looking at the developed photos. She then closes the curtains and places them in a projector. And as she flips through them, she notices one that catches her eye. She adjusts the focus and sees Candyman standing behind her. Helen then walks into the bathroom and opens up the medicine cabinet. And as she looks behind her, Candyman's hook bursts through the mirror. She runs from the apartment, but sees him standing in the hallway. He says to her, "Believe in me. Be my victim." She runs back into the apartment and attempts to call someone, anyone, but he's standing right behind her. He asks her, "Do you believe in me? I have the child. Allow me to take you, or he will die in your place." Candyman then gives her a vision of Anthony in the abandoned apartment, and then says, "Your disbelief destroyed the faith of my congregation. Without them, I am nothing. So I was obliged to come, and now I must kill you. Your death will be a tale to frighten children, to make lovers cling closer in their rapture. Come with me and be immortal." Bernadette rings the doorbell and calls to Helen, who is bleeding from the side of her head after Candyman cut her with his hook. She calls out weakly before slumping to the floor. After a few seconds, Helen finally cries out and tells Bernadette to go, and hearing this, she walks into the apartment and sees Helen bleeding on the ground. She also sees Candyman, who raises his bloody hook and kills her. Helen then hears footsteps and sees Trevor, who is shocked to find her on the ground, covered in blood, holding a kitchen knife. The next scene shows Helen in bed. She is handcuffed and calling for Trevor. She runs out of the room and sees Bernadette lying dead on the ground. A quick cutscene shows a swarm of bees. And this is the end of Act 2. Alright, so obviously Act 2 has significantly more action and gore than Act 1. At this point, we're fully introduced to Candyman, and we watch as the tables turn a bit for Helen. She's accused of not only one murder, but two. And we're not quite sure what the reality is. Did Candyman actually commit the murders and frame Helen? Or did she imagine Candyman and commit the murders herself? To me, this is what makes this movie so effective. Urban legends leave us unsure about what we see and hear. For instance, the killer in the back seat legend is uncomfortable because what is that sound in your car while you're driving at night? Is it just a random creak or bump? Or is it a deranged killer lying in wait? It's really difficult to show that tension, and honestly, it usually works better on paper. But so far, Candyman is doing a pretty good job of towing that line. I also think Candyman's line, quote, "Your disbelief destroyed the faith of my congregation. Without them, I am nothing," is super important because it straddles the line between reality and fiction. Candyman is, in fact, an urban legend, a literal figment of imagination. But his legend grows and endures and affects the real world through the faith of those who believe in him. It says something about the power of oral tradition and word of mouth. I think of stories I heard as a kid that were deeply implanted in my heart and mind. And today, over 30 years later, their influence is still there. In fact, it's part of the reason why I love horror movies. And when you take those stories, however strange or unreal that they may seem, and tell them across the generations, well, you have something deeply powerful and personal. And it's interesting, because Candyman chooses Helen, not for her belief in him, but because of her unbelief, and the effect that that unbelief had on those who had faith. His power is in the story carrying on, and as long as people are talking about Candyman, there will be people who fear him, and he can then exist in the world. Alright, let's jump back into Act 3. Act 3 opens with Helen being transported to the hospital. Candyman's voices overlaid the scene, saying, "Why do you want to live? If you would just learn a little from me, you would not beg to live. I am rumor. It is a blessed condition, believe me, to be whispered about on street corners, to live in other people's dreams, but not have to be. Do you understand?" He gives her a vision of the abandoned apartment, with Anthony alive and crying in the background. Helen prays that God would protect the baby. She is then wheeled back to a room and transferred to a bed, her arms and legs restrained. She pleads to be let go and struggles against the restraints unsuccessfully. Suddenly, Candyman appears before her, floating above her body. He says to her, "What do the good know? Accept what the bad teach them by their excesses. Allow me at least a kiss, just one exquisite kiss." He gives her another vision of Anthony, and she in turn calls out for Trevor. The hospital staff rush in, and she tells them that Candyman is under the bed. Not listening to her, they instead sedate her. The next scene takes us to the abandoned apartment where Anthony lies calmly. Candyman appears next to him and feeds him honey. We then see Helen is still in the hospital room, fully restrained. She asks to speak to Trevor and wants to know where they are going. She is being wheeled to Dr. Burke's office. Presumably, he's the hospital psychiatrist. He introduces himself, and she says she would like to speak to Trevor. She asks if she's been committed and asks again if the restraints are necessary. Dr. Burke shows her paperwork and says she's been detained for at least a month on a heavy dose of Thorazine. She asks for her attorney, and Dr. Burke tells her that they have to assess her ability to stand trial on first-degree murder charges. He asks her what happened in Anne-Marie's apartment, but Helen remains quiet. He shows her a recording from the day of her admission, where she seems to be struggling against Candyman. Dr. Burke switches off the recording, and Helen says she's not capable of murder. She says she can prove it by calling Candyman. She looks in the mirror and says Candyman 5 times, and initially, nothing happens. But then, Dr. Burke begins screaming as Candyman shows up behind him and hooks him to death. Candyman says to her, "You're mine now. Tonight our congregation shall witness a new miracle. Then he takes off the restraints and flies backwards out of the window. Helen, now free, climbs out of the window as hospital staff work to get into the room. Helen inches along the outside of the hospital and steals a nurse's scrubs before walking out of the building. Helen runs back to her apartment, where she discovers Trevor in the apartment with the student, Stacy, painting. Trevor is startled to see her and tells Stacy to call the hospital. Helen is pissed, but remains calm. She tells him she hates the color scheme, which is now bubblegum pink. He says they should call the hospital, but that doesn't happen. She tells Trevor it's over and walks out of the apartment. Alright, fuck Trevor. Look, I know this is a horror movie podcast, and it's generally not that serious, but fuck Trevor for cheating on Helen. Organ music plays as Helen stands on a bridge overlooking the Chicago River. Candyman's voice calls to her, saying, "They will all abandon you. All you have left is my desire for you." The next scene takes us to Cabrini Green at night, where Helen enters the abandoned apartment and pulls a hook from a chain hanging from the ceiling. She climbs up into an upstairs apartment and moves cautiously, where she finds a picture of Candyman painted on the wall. It's a mural that shows his murder. She turns and sees him lying on a table. He's asleep, and as she approaches and raises the hook, he wakes up and calls to her, "Helen, you came to me. Surrender to me now, and he shall be unharmed." Helen wants to keep her end of the deal, and Candyman picks her up and walks through the apartment, saying the pain will be exquisite. He says, "Our names will be written on 1,000 walls, our crimes told and retold by our faithful believers. We shall die together in front of their very eyes and give them something to be haunted by. Come with me and be immortal." As Helen comes to, she notices her hand is covered in bees. Then she looks at Candyman, and he opens his coat, revealing his ribcage and abdominal cavity covered in bees. His mouth, too, is full of them. He bends over to kiss Helen, and when she pulls away, her face is now covered in them as well. We get a quick shot of Anthony as Candyman carries him away. Helen wakes up disoriented, picks up the hook, and walks cautiously through the apartment. She notices writing on the wall, "It was always you, Helen," as the Candyman theme song plays. She looks on as her face appears on the wall, with Candyman saying, "It was always you, Helen. It was always you." She hears Anthony crying, and she walks back towards Anne-Marie's apartment before noticing the woodpile outside the building. She scrambles through it as she hears Anthony crying somewhere in the middle. The clatter awakens Jake, and Helen eventually finds Anthony in the middle of the pile. Jake whispers to himself, "He's here," and gathers others from Cabrini Green, torches in hand. They pour gasoline on the woodpile as Helen crawls towards Anthony. The entire community of Cabrini Green walks towards the pile, and as Helen holds Anthony, Candyman appears behind her saying, "I knew you'd come." The residents light torches and throw them on the woodpile, as Candyman, Helen, and Anthony are still in there. They're chanting, "Burn him," as Helen cries for help. She tells Candyman that he lied to her and to let her go. He says to her, "I cannot. We are already dead." She then grabs a piece of wood and stabs Candyman before trying to crawl out. As she does, a piece of wood hits her in the back, pinning her to the ground and setting her clothing on fire. Her back and hair are on fire as she manages to crawl out of the pile. Anthony is protected by her body. Recognizing what's happening, the residents rush to put out the fire, and we see that she's badly burned on her back and head. Anne-Marie grabs Anthony, and as Candyman perishes, a swarm of bees escape from the burning pile. Jake watches as he burns to death. Helen unfortunately dies in the fire, and we watch as she is buried. Trevor and Stacy are there, observing in tears. Just as the priest finishes his prayer, the residents of Cabrini Green show up to pay their respects. Back in his apartment, Trevor is struggling with Helen's death as Stacy asks him to help her make dinner. She's annoyed as she prepares a steak, and Trevor has flashbacks of happier times with Helen, and immediately begins sobbing. He calls to her 5 times in the mirror, and she shows up behind him, saying, "What's the matter, Trevor? Scared of something?" She then guts him with a hook, and Stacy discovers him dead in the bathtub, gutted from genitals to gullet. Then the end credits roll. And that is the end of Candyman. Alright, let's take a second to catch our breath. To me, Candyman is one of the most unique horror movies ever made. It's a slasher, but it's not. It has elements of gothic horror, but it's not entirely that either. I'd say it's mostly supernatural horror, and it's a damn good one. For me, it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and it may sneak into my top 25 best horror movies ever made. Alright, let's talk about the bee scene really quickly, because it's the stuff of legend. Pun actually intended. The bees in the film are real, they're not CGI. And Tony Todd really put hundreds of bees in his mouth, on his face, and all over his body. But there was a catch. He contracted to be paid $1,000 for every bee sting he received. And he ended up with 23 total stings. And once the scene was completed, it took over 90 minutes to remove them fully from his body. You know, there's something really interesting about this movie too. It was a bit controversial when it was released. Now, I generally think this is true of most movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In fact, some of my favorite horror movies have some pretty terrible elements that absolutely didn't age well at all. Something I noticed in Candyman, and it's especially obvious in Act 1, is that even though it's a movie about the black community that was filmed in a black neighborhood, yes, some of the scenes were actually filmed in Cabrini Green, and that has a black antagonist, so much of the movie focuses on the experiences of Helen, a white woman. And when we're introduced to Candyman, first in urban legend, and then in real life, it's through these stories of him killing black women, men, and children. And to add to it, the murderous villain was summoned by Helen, a white woman. And what that does is set us up for one of my least favorite tropes in any movie, the white savior. I'll explain what I mean by highlighting a non-horror movie as an example. One of my favorite movies is Sicario, with Emily Blunt, Daniel Kaluuya, Josh Brolin, and Benicio del Toro. In Sicario, Emily Blunt plays a federal agent who wants to take down the drug cartels, quote-unquote, the right way. She stands as a bastion of rightness amidst the chaos and corruption around her. It's a common trope, a white savior hell-bent on saving non-white folks from the unfortunate situations they find themselves in. In Helen's case, she's hell-bent on solving the plight of the black community in Cabrini Green. Except instead of listening to the black community itself and working alongside them, she takes matters into her own hands, often with tragic results. I've also heard some concern about Candyman, a black man, romancing Helen, a white woman. Look, I'm a Hispanic man who is married to a white woman and who has 3 beautiful interracial children. It's really difficult for me to decry the love story within the movie, because I think interracial relationships are beautiful. But it's important to understand that the concern isn't so much about an interracial relationship, as much as it's about the trope of black men hunting and preying upon white women. Right now, we're less than a month away from the 70th anniversary of the lynching of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was lynched by white supremacists after being accused of whistling at a white woman. Except the story was complete bullshit, and a teenager lost his life simply for being black. You heard that right. The accusation against Emmett Till was a complete lie, and his murder was one of the sparks that ignited the civil rights movement. With Candyman and Helen's romance, there is something I'm appreciative of. It's that Candyman never sexually assaults Helen. The sexual tension is obvious, and Candyman is equally murderous and seductive. But he never assaults her, and it can be argued that he waits until she gives consent before moving in. At the same time, Candyman has a semblance of social consciousness. Helen and Bernadette lament the gentrification of the area, where Cabrini Green was left as a low-income housing project, while her condo, which is quote-unquote on the right side of the tracks, is described and rebranded as luxurious, despite being near identical. We also see that Anne-Marie rightly calls out the stereotypes levied against the black community, that they all steal, gangbang, and are all on drugs, and that Helen rightly mentions the police came running to save her, a white woman, while letting Ruthie Jean and the young boy, both black, die without their intervention. The problem is that Candyman doesn't explore these storylines any further, or even counter them within the narrative. Anne-Marie was a terrific character who was ultimately sidelined to push Helen's narrative forward. And even though director Bernard Rose went out of his way to highlight Anne-Marie's struggle, she just became another prop in Helen and Candyman's story. Now I will say, her story is explored in the 2021 Candyman remake, which was directed by Nia DaCosta, a black woman. But this movie, felt like a missed opportunity for both redirection and redemption. Despite this, I think there are some really terrific moments in this film, and it absolutely is required viewing for any horror fan. It's so unique and so unpredictable, and Tony Todd and Virginia Madsen are so damn captivating that you won't want to miss it. For those that have seen it, I always ask the question, what do you think of this film? It's time for one of my favorite parts of the show, where I highlight what you thought about Candyman. And not surprisingly, it's nearly universally loved. From Gutted Horror Podcast, the score, the lore, I still won't say Candyman 5 times, Virginia Madsen, and of course everything Tony Todd, from his voice, to his power pose in a parking garage with a floor-length fur coat, and his dedication to his craft and willingness to be stung by multiple bees in the mouth. From Real Talk, Candyman is wild. The lore behind it is so deep, and it's more than just a scary story. It dives into real stuff like racism and gentrification through this creepy urban legend that actually makes you think. Plus, Clive Barker's original novella, The Forbidden, is wonderful. From the Scary Movie Project. While the music is tremendous, and the setting in Cabrini Green is perfect for the urban legend story. Wonderful film. From Tequila_Siren. Love everything. Tony Todd was mesmerizing. From Opening_Kill_Pod. Tony freaking Todd. I also love how it dove into important social issues like race, gentrification, etc. It's a really powerful movie, and one that is always a treat to revisit. From Alfonso.Zavala.90038. I love the lore of the original Candyman, and how it was tied to one of the most infamous housing projects in the U.S., Cabrini Green. From Chiller's Podcast. I hate that it traumatized me at age 7 when I first watched it. I love the story, and the unflinching approach to racial aspects in the story. From In Dark We Rise Pod. Was too enthralled with his performance in Night of the Living Dead to give it a fair shot when this came out. From Projectile__Varmint. Tony Todd has such presence and swagger, you almost forget that he's the bad guy at some points. He can jump through the mirror and get me any day. I don't love the vilification of the black community and the reliance on stereotypes of inner city life, such as crime, neglect, and violence. I hate that they made a black man, the quote-unquote monster, being obsessed with a white woman. This movie is also told through a white lens, and written by a white male director. How are we accurately portraying the black experience of growing up in the inner city? From Lord of the Plains 90. I love Tony Todd's effortlessly cool and sinister performance more than anything else. He combined real seductive charm with authentically brutal menace. Even though Candyman is absolutely his own entity, Todd truly gave one of the greatest Dracula performances of all time. From Shuttergus71. When people ask me for a scary movie they likely haven't seen, I recommend this. Bonus points for being a solid Chicago film. From Steve Lurkel. I love the fact that it's easily one of the greatest horror romances of all time ever. Tony Todd's performance, the score, the cinematic creativity, and the weird use of bees. The only thing that I hate about that film is the fact that it gave me a permanent fear of mirrors in the dark. From You Are a Unicorn 528491. I love a lot of things about the original Candyman movie. Tony Todd's performance, his voice, that scene in the parking garage, and Philip Glass's music, to name a few. From This_holds_up. I love how they turned the Chicago hood into a gritty, haunting, atmospheric horror setting. I love everything about the character Candyman. The lore, the look, the brutality, and the iconic performance by the late Tony Todd. From Jake the Snake 1854. Tony Todd's unforgettable performance, the atmosphere, and the score. And last but not least, from Cinematic Nightmares podcast. Tony Todd made Candyman unforgettable. His haunting voice, elegant presence, and eyes full of tragedy. He wasn't just a villain. He was poetry, pain, and power wrapped in one. A horror icon with depth. A huge shout out to each person who took the time to comment their love for this film. I really appreciate it. And a special shout out to Mika G from the Cinematic Nightmares podcast. She does a fantastic job exploring horror. You can find her show wherever you stream podcasts and on YouTube. I'll give a quick comment before we wrap up. To this day, I have never said Candyman in the mirror 5 times. Do I know it's an urban legend? Of course. Am I going to do it anyway? No, of course not. Listen, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend that you give it a watch. Also, you should watch the remake if you've never seen it. It's a similar story that goes in its own direction, and I'm planning to cover it in a future episode of One Good Scare. Alright, that's a wrap for this episode. As always, thanks for spending your time with me. I don't take it for granted. And of course, be sure to join me next episode as we dive head first into an iconic horror movie with an equally iconic horror villain, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Till next time, I'm your host Will. Thanks for hanging out.